It was the war. It's always the war. The war that drives us to fight. The war that fights us to protect. The war that forces us to flee. And that is what we did. Refugees from several different worlds banded together after watching their homeworlds burn under the wars that just never stopped. They had their own protectors, their own armored angels as they believed them to be, but they turned out to be demons in angels' clothing as they began to tear through the civilian populace. It didn't matter what color they were: red, blue, black, white, yellow. It did not matter to them as they tore through all of us. And that was just the humans. In truth, the war reaches far beyond what we know from it. However, what we do know is every time you try to build yourself up and build a peaceful planet, something you can actually raise your children on, some place where you can live a long life, the war always comes back. Those that are in charge begin to demand things from you. If I hear Mechanicus one more time, I was going to pick up one of those bolters and use it. But eventually, we got on what ships we could, and we left. An exodus. An exodus deep into unknown space as we reached out into the stars looking for any place we could reside. Any place where we did not have to worry about our own people destroying us just because. If there was one thing we feared above all at that point, all of us feared what they deem exterminatus. No quarter given, no chance of redemption, no options for even surrender, and they would just end us. And if it wasn't for other humans, Lord knows what was streaking out in the void. As the exodus continued, we reached beyond. We saw several of the space hulks floating, and we kept our distance. We knew how dangerous they were, and we were not armored. We were simple people. We simply wanted to be left the hell alone. But of course, that wouldn't happen unless we found a place out in the stars far beyond what humans and those Xenos were contemplating to fight over next. And what we found astounded us. Almost losing every single one of our ships through the storm, the strange ion blasts around fried half of the circuits as we finally got through to the other side of that horrible nebula. But the nebula stretched almost the entire way around the sector itself. The sun seemed to not only pull the nebula towards, but also seemed to reflect it away. After 7 planets, although there were 12, but the 7 most inner planets were protected, and the nebula seemed to wrap us in a cocoon that was similar to a warm blanket on a cold day. And we knew when we landed on that 3rd planet that we had finally found a place where we could reside. Our numbers were not many. Our numbers only stretched about 48,000. That was all. Not much, but enough to start again. And what we found out as we kept going amazed us. We found that these planets, something about this sector was unique amongst the stars, and we realized that there was something we could become beyond what we were. It took many years of reaching out to each of the planets, setting up different cultures and societies in their own planets so they could create their own worlds by themselves, coming together only as a council to make sure that no one was trying to impede on others. But having an own world to yourself, why would you? Why would you? Our population was growing, slowly, mind you. But we had found out that something had happened in the void, something that had changed us. The ion storm that we came through, since our vessels were not shielded at all, it had done something to us. We did not age at the same rate. In fact, we wondered if we aged at all after 200 or 300 years. We lost count, most of us. We watched our children grow, and they had children, and we all grew to be ourselves, but we never had to bury one, at least not due to age. And we were grateful for this. Every year, starting up in the spring and realizing that we were far from the war, from the orcs, from the other humans, from all sorts of horrors out in the void. At least, we thought we were. Through the ion storm, we saw something fly in and crash on the fourth planet. We didn't know what it was, but of course we sent rescue ships to find what was going on, and we asked the local government, "Do you need assistance?" They didn't respond, which made us very, very nervous. And before we knew it, the planet had been taken. It had been taken by some sort of demon race, something I had never seen before. A few of them had, and they called them the Drunkharry. These Drunkharry did look like demons, and they acted as such. They seemed to enjoy reaching out to the other planets and try to snatch ours, but we realized that we needed to defend ourselves, and the best minds we had were put to work. I helped them develop something interesting. It was a style of bolter, but it was much smaller. It could be lifted and held and used by any of our soldiers. Our new equipment was slightly better than what we had before, but we knew to defeat these demons, we needed something stronger. We prayed. We prayed that we could contain them on the fourth planet as best we could. We prayed that they would not reach out, but these Drunkharries came out at us, and they began to take over different planets. It seemed that they reveled in our misery, not trying to kill us right away, even though not in a high number, and we could definitely kill them, but it did take a lot as they moved very fast for their size. So we fought, and we prayed. And one day we believed our prayers may have been answered as another ship began to tear through the storm. The nebula had tore this ship almost asunder, and it was a hulking wreck, just like the demon's ship. It streaked down onto the third planet where I was, and we hoped it didn't hit hard enough to kill everyone inside, as we could only pray that inside was our salvation. We may have been right. Who or whatever was in it, we didn't know at the time. All we knew is that it was able to hold up the nose of the aircraft. This ship strafed in, ripping apart acre after acre of harvested crops, setting many of them alight with its fire. And we put the fires out as we ran up, and we saw the ship was mostly intact. And when we cracked it open, we received a shock. Inside were women. These women were very tall, very large, all of them with ghostly white hair, a strange mark on their face, and they all wore armor and carried weapons. Were these the Battle Sisters? Unfortunately, we could only save two. I say save two, but we actually got another one out, and she was non-responsive, in some sort of coma, as we could find almost a heartbeat, almost a pulse. So we immediately got her to our medical facilities, and we began to throw her into the tank. The tank is just a simple term for a regeneration tank, something that we had been able to develop since we had so much time to work. And to our surprise, we saw that it was instantly starting to heal her, but her body was mangled. It would take months before she was back on her feet, so we simply had our two. And when they awoke, They began to demand that we tell them how to get a hold of the Empire, and we told them you can't do that from here. Inside the nebula, nothing goes out, just like when you came in, you weren't supposed to. They told us that they were in combat with a different type of Xeno. I can't even pronounce the damn name, nor did I care. We simply told them that the Dakharis were here, and with that, they sprung to life. They told us we had to get them over and face them. We simply said, "You're not going alone." They looked at us and laughed and claimed, "What could you possibly do?" We laughed at them and said, "You'd be surprised." Less than an hour later, we were loading the shuttle. The two sisters were going in, and they were given the call signs Angels 1 and 2. Angels 1 and 2 were loaded, and were surprised at the efficiency of our own military, our own forces. Our battle armor seemed to be almost thinner than that of the regular guard. Our helmets were not nearly as bulky, yet seemed to have more protection to them. It was a full face covering. It was a full body covering. The only time they had seen this is when they worked with the Blood Angels or Blood Ravens or any of the others that were there. But now it was time for them to see what we could do. When we landed, we did not land unopposed. The Dakhari decided to come at us with some sort of weapons. I didn't know what, but it didn't matter. As soon as we got to the ground, we jumped out the back and we told the pilot to punch it and get out. We'll call you if we need you. With this, the Angels look at us with confusion. Are you seriously leaving yourselves to die? I still remember one of my subordinates chambering his weapon and looking up at her and saying, "Who said anything about dying today?" With that, we began to move forward. The Angels were with us, and with the Angels, we began to take the planet back. Sector by sector, block by block, building by building, we began to move. They moved with an elegance I did not expect from one so large and ones so beautiful, which is why we called them our angels. With their help, we were able to fight back the Dakhari, and we began to take back that planet. Within a single planetary rotation, we had more reinforcements landing, and they brought more weapons and more personnel. And the Dakhari, for the first time in many years, were afraid. They were afraid that our angels were going to take them apart because we had something with us that helped out our angels. We used the angels as the point of the spear, but the spear itself is not just its point. Our micronized bolters were able to do serious damage to the Dakhari. And if that wasn't enough, the angels, with their unrelenting fury, began to come down on them with blade and bolter alike. And it was not too long before the angels looked worried. We were already 3 planetary rotations in when they started to freak out. We asked what was wrong. "We have no more bolter ammunition. We're taking these on hand to hand now." We all looked at each other. "What do you mean you don't have more bolter ammunition?" "We have expended our ammunition." "Why didn't you just ask us for more?" They looked at us confused. That is until we called on the radio and returned their magazines fully loaded, and the assault continued. Our angels led the way across the planet, and before an entire month had passed, we had taken the entire continent, and only 2 more to go. The Dakhari seemed to fall at the hands of our angels, and if they did not fall to the angels, we made sure that these demons paid the price for facing us as well. It was not long before the angels had taught us how to take down these Dakhari, to let us know where to aim, how the Dakhari moved. And with that information, we took more of them then they took of us a lot more. Our medical staff came in constantly. Our medics were taking the wounded out, and we were replaced with fresh bodies constantly. And eventually we got to the shoreline, but the Dark Harry did not have a way to cross, and we all know what happens with a cornered animal. Before the final assault, one of the angels stated how the Emperor would love us in their guard, would immediately conscript us, and the way we were fighting demand that we become their space marines. With this, all our bloods ran cold. We wondered then if we had just allowed the angels to come here to save us or to enslave us, to conquer us. But until this battle is over, we wouldn't know. As we prepared for the final assault on the coastal city, we looked at our two angels that seemed to shimmer in the morning sunlight. Their white hair seemed to almost flow as though small wings. The armor that they never removed shimmered with the little bit that was not covered with Dark Harry blood. As beautiful as the sight was, we all went in with a little trepidation. Were we going to free this continent just to be under the yoke of the Empire? Didn't we leave them? But it wouldn't matter if we did not clear this planet, because the Dark Harry would eventually simply rebuild, rearm, and assault us again. So we did not have a choice but to finish this fight. As one of the angels raised her sword, she screamed for the Emperor's name, which was met by silence. They both looked at us confused, and I raised my weapon, and I screamed to the heavens, "For our families, for our homes, and for those that these demons have taken from us, charge!" And with that, everyone ran, even past the angels, as they looked almost confused at us running past. At full sprint, we charged over the hill. They seemed to be in complete awe at the idea that anyone would fight for something other than the Emperor, but this hesitation only lasted a few seconds as we started receiving fire from some of the buildings, and we charged en masse into the maw of death as we fired back into whatever opening we saw. It didn't matter if it was a window, a door, or anything else like that. Artillery flew over our head as air support began to whip by and launch all sorts of ordnance. We charged into the buildings and cleared them one by one with mechanical precision. The angels took point. They always pushed forward. We could never tell them to hold back and wait at a phase line. They continued to push forward, never stopping, seeming to be in a blind rage as they wanted to kill any Dark Harry they found. It didn't matter, old, young, it didn't matter. They all fell under the angel's sword. But the Dark Harry, as stated before, were backed up against the wall. We did not know this, but the Dark Harry can't swim at all. They sink. And since they had no vessels to take them across the vast oceans, they didn't have a choice but to stand and fight, and a cornered animal that is forced to fight will fight with unholy abandon, and that is what they did. The battle itself turned into a massive melee. As bolters were firing, blades clashed, whips flailed about in all different directions. It got so bad that the Dark Harry began even using their claws and their teeth, their massive size, as they began to crash into us, force us down, and try to aim for the weaker spots in our armor. And we would laugh as they would slash and then realize, only for a moment, that our armor was not what they were used to facing. And that moment later, one of our comrades would simply blow multiple holes through the Dark Harry, and we would watch it fall like some massive tree as it fell backwards. I was covered in blood by the time we got halfway through the city. It took us the entire day, but we couldn't stop because the angels wouldn't stop. The angels continued to push towards the port area being the last area that they could hold up. It was too heavy fortified a building to be taken down by simple airstrikes. Artillery would work, but we would burn through ordnance for days to crumple even a single building. And that is when we faced them. The Dark Harry had brought forth something massive, something I was not expecting, but it seemed as though they had mutated one of their kind to come at us. It came at us with unholy abandon, 4 arms flailing about, what I could see at least 3 limbs on the base, holding it up, trotting it forward in a strange manner as it flailed at them. The angels ran at this thing, and I watched in horror as it flung them off to the side, both of them going in opposite directions, and without hesitation, it locked on one of them and charged down. The angel held up her massive sword as her bolter had flung out of her hand. She was able to block one of the blades, but another one plunged deep into her abdomen. So deep, in fact, that the blade stuck into the ground. She screamed in pain, in agony, and in rage. And in that moment, everything stopped. At that moment, everyone's mind that had seen that had sped up to a degree that we did not know was possible. And at that moment, the call came out. The one we were dreading would ever be sent out. They started screaming, "Fallen angel! Fallen angel!" Everyone looked at their video feed. They clicked it on, and they saw one of our angels slowly seeming to lose consciousness as she began to fade down, almost unable to hold her massive sword up anymore as the blade from the other hand kept closer and closer to her face. And that is when something instinctual came up into all of us. Something in us men, our protector instinct, something that we had only known a little bit of, but we could not sit and watch this beautiful angel be sliced in half slowly in front of our eyes. Jumping from cover, everyone came out, all guns blazing as they laid into this massive beast. The beast turned to us and tried to draw its sword back out of the ground, but was unable to as multiple small bolter hits began to crash into it. It wasn't long before one of our men pulled out his shoulder-fired bolter. This one was 3 times the size of a standard bolter and fired straight into the beast standing in front of us. The bolter itself only grazed it, but it was enough to rip off one of its arms. It began to flail in pain, and the rest of us jumped on top of it, holding it down, while others grabbed whatever blades they could to jab into it, firing multiple bolters into its face, into its chest, until it finally stopped moving. We didn't understand at that point that we had been fired upon the entire time. I looked over and realized I had taken 2 hits, one in the leg, one in the side, and as blood poured from my armor, I turned, but I couldn't feel anything. Nothing but sheer rage. The other angel screamed out to her sister to see if she was okay, but we didn't even hesitate to charge the enemy lines. The medics began to swarm over the fallen angel, and I only remember a few minutes later, as I began to lose consciousness from lack of blood, how we had stormed through the building and cut through every one of the Dark Harry. It didn't matter if they were even begging for mercy. We had reached our limit. And as I went back towards the 3rd floor, I looked out the window and I could see them cutting the sword from the ground. The Dark Harry blade was not nearly as strong as the angel's blade. However, it was enough to do the job. And I saw the body slump as the blade was finally cut, and they loaded her onto a transport. They didn't cover her with a sheet, so I knew there was a bonus. It was about that time one of my own subordinates, "Look, are you okay?" I simply looked at him. I don't think so. I think I might have got clipped. And then the world went dark on me. I woke up in the Mobile Army's surgical hospital. They had put me back together, and thankfully somebody had some extra blood I could use, as I was running way low on it. As they loaded me up on a transport, I could see that the angel had also been taken. She was on a massive stretcher and put on her own transport. The blade had been removed from her abdomen, and she had been bandaged up. But they were in a massive rush to get her back and put her in one of the tanks. We knew the tank couldn't hold many more than just her. Normally it's enough where you could put 3 or 4 of us in. But they wanted to keep the angel alive. Out in the distance, I didn't hear any more weapons fire. Looking around, I didn't see any more massive movements. The battle must have been over, and I was grateful for it. I would gain consciousness 2 or 3 more times as we would travel back to our home planet. As I was being brought out of the ambulance, I looked over and I could hear people talking about the angel and how they had finally got her into the tank. She was alive, but barely. She was in some sort of coma the docs couldn't understand. But I didn't care. I just needed some time. To my surprise, those back home had been busy. They had created other tanks, the tanks to drop us into to make us heal. I was amazed that my injuries healed in less than 16 hours, and I was back into fighting shape. I immediately went back, got my armor, got my gear, and was back on the line, looking at our one angel as she looked across the ocean. But she was not looking over the ocean with pride, no. I could see her holding her head down. She was worried. She was worried for her sister. I walked up next to her, and I realized something strange. They had done something to me in the tank. Either the angel had shrunk, or I had gotten slightly taller. It didn't matter. I walked up, tapped her on the shoulder to let her know I was there, and then simply stated, "Don't worry, they'll take really good care of her." She didn't even look at me, but I could see the concern for her sister in her eyes. Turning to look out in the ocean, I simply stated to her, "Don't worry, Angel. We'll take really good care of your family. You're one of us now, after all." After taking the first continent out of the 3 that were on this rock, everyone was chomping at the bit to get this battle over with. As the faster this battle was over, the faster we could go home to our families. Well, those that have families. It took about 48 hours for fresh supplies to roll in and fresh gear to make it to us. They also, surprisingly, brought us boats. Wasn't expecting that. I figured they were going to lift us over on VTOLs or something and then just drop us off. But apparently the scouts had realized that this was the safer bet. The Dark Airs had been over there preparing all sorts of anti-ship weapons. However, these were for any type of aerial ship. Any vessel that was on the ocean seemed to be getting ready to face minimal resistance. Although I was not too happy about being inside one of these tin cans, just slowly motoring up to the beach. None of us looked forward to it. Even though the beach was just over the horizon and we could be there in less than an hour, it was still a long ride, and we were not looking forward to it. However, for us to maintain our aggression, to keep our fight going as strong as it was, we needed to take the beach and we needed to stop those guns. We needed to make sure that our airships could get across. We couldn't get anything orbital to end up, as they had missile systems. what was left over from our folks, which was enough. As the man says, there's a million ways to die in space, and they all suck. Regardless of that, we all got ready. The boats sat very, very low in the water. In fact, the majority of our bodies were actually below the waterline as the boats made their way. The tops themselves were armored, designed specifically to deflect blasts off them. This was our only protection. The driver, the pilot, was up in the back, and I remember seeing old images of an ancient vessel that was similar to this. The captain could see, but just barely, and we knew we were heading straight towards the beach when we suddenly heard all the engines around us, to include the boat that we were on, immediately crank up beyond 90%. They must have been pushing the motors up to about 120, as the engines you could hear straining against the surf. As we went up, we could also hear impacts all around us, the water splashing against the side as ordnance became more and more prevalent. The pilot in the back got smart, and he began to move the ship back and forth, but he neglected to tell us as we ended up being thrown against the side, one after the other. I looked back, and the Angel towards the rear of the craft was able to hold herself up without much issue. The rest of us bounced up against each other. And then we heard it, that unmistakable sound of the beach. The sand went underneath the boat, and immediately the door dropped in less than a second. It was a free fall door, and suddenly we were out in the open. We ran out as fast as we could under a hail of any type of ordnance that was coming down. This was not standard bullets or bolters. This was not any type of energy weapon that we knew of. But ordnance was still coming in just the same. They must have thought we were nuts to hit the beach with such a massive force. However, with such a force, we could overwhelm their defenses if we continued to push. It was something out of one of ancient Terra's old battles. As we pushed our way to the beach, we didn't have any fences or wires or obstacles to come across, and there was no cliff face to enter against. However, we did still have to climb up above the sand line and onto the shore itself. And then, and only then, would we be face to face with the enemy. Our Angel tried to lead the way, but she didn't realize that she stuck out amongst all of us, and the enemy decided to fire directly at her. We saw her get thrown to the side several times with ordnance, and she had to crawl her way back up. More than once, several of our men grabbed a hold of her underneath her armpits and dragged her behind some sort of cover as she got her wits about her again. However, this gave us the opening we needed. This is what we needed to get through, as the ordnance was aimed at her and not the rest of us, as we charged the positions. And when we finally got there, we found out the positions were barely occupied at all. They had the right weapons. They were positioned in exactly the right place, but there was almost none there. It seemed like those behind were simply a skeleton force, somehow designed to slow us down, but there was no way they could stop us. Or did they just not know we were coming? It didn't matter. Continuing to push forward, we could hear over the radio them relaying positions of the artillery and also the missile batteries. We continued our way up, and our Angel caught up to us very, very quickly and began to use herself as kind of a decoy, as she would jump around and we would just see her almost fly through the air. Her white hair flailing up as she did, raising her sword in one hand and her bolter in the other, firing away. It was almost in slow motion as our Angel flew through the air. Our Angel of Darkness came down like the hammer of God onto the enemy lines, and we bust through. With bolter and bayonet, we struck through each of the lines, and every one of the Dakar ended up at our feet, most of which had been blasted several times, It was very common that one would sit there with their bolter rifle and fire several more times into the body just to make sure the fucker was down. We didn't know. These things were known for jumping up out of nowhere, and the last thing we needed is one surviving. But it was strange. There was still not as many as we thought. Considering the fight that we had on the previous continent, this whole place should be coated with them. But they're not. It was odd. It was very, very, very odd. But we didn't have time to think about it. As we continued our push, this was the smallest of the 3 continents, and it would take us about 4 days to push across. And we did so without hesitation, without sleep, without stopping. We continued. The enemy was seen trying to get their affairs in order, trying to get their guns adjusted so that they could stop our onslaught, but we were coming too fast. This old-fashioned blitzkrieg came across their land, and they only had one choice of survival: to run. Of course, they don't run. Not unless ordered to. It was amazing to see them actually standing there, many of them holding simple whips, though those whips were coated in some sort of barbed material to make sure that if they did hit you, it would be enough to almost pierce all the way through our armor, and if God help you, it hit you in one of your unprotected areas, would slice through you and rip through you like you chainsaw. As we hit the final line, they stood with their backs against the ocean and tried to face us down with every piece of ordnance they had left. At this point, I had watched many of my own men fall, and I was more than a little pissed. However, not nearly as much as our angel. That angel of darkness still continued. I don't know how she kept the ferocity going, but the sheer hatred in her eyes as she would bring her sword down and slice into one of the Darkairs and just tear it to pieces. She eventually would run out of ammunition and holster her bolter and then simply go at them, taking multiple hits in her armor as she continued to fight her way through. The rest of us, seeing her, would never leave her behind. And never fall behind either. We pushed as hard as we could until we reached the ocean, and the last one stood there and dropped to its knees as it finally ran out of blood, taking over a dozen different bolter rifle hits. It was done. As we peered over the area, we all looked to see the destruction. We were all still pumped full of adrenaline, all of us still wide awake. And then something jumped out of nowhere. I saw it come up. It went right after our angel. I was not going to let this happen. I raised my rifle up across my body and jumped in between the two. It was one of the Darkairs. It had come back, and this time it had a blade. It was going to pierce through our angel, but I didn't let it. I deflected it with a rifle, but still it came down, shoving the hilt clean through my chest plate and right into my abdomen. The hilt got stuck in my armor. I looked up as I could see my blood squirting out straight across Darkair's face. And then, without a moment's hesitation, that bright blue sword swung across and chopped the Darkair in half. The look of fear in its face. It must have known the moment right before it happened. I looked up at our angel, and she looked down to me, again with a little bit of fear in her eyes. She picked me up, yanked the blade out of me, which was a bad idea as I could feel myself start to bleed out as it squirted all over the place. It must have nicked one of my arteries, I thought to myself. I looked up and didn't realize I had blood on my hand, and I said to her, "My angel, protect them. Bring them home." And then my eyesight began to fade. I slumped down as I did not have any feeling left. My adrenaline had left me, and so had much of the blood. Medics were already on me as I saw the look of sheer hatred in her eyes. As she looked around, it wasn't just me on the ground, but so many of us had fallen prey to the enemy's weapons. She looked at her hand, and she clenched her fist. Then she looked at her blade and ignited it once again in that blue electric shine, and the hatred had returned to her eyes. We heard the scream of a few of the dark hairs that had somehow survived, that we had somehow missed. And the last thing I saw was her scream and running with her blade already cocked back, ready to take down another one of those demon bastards. And I thought to myself, hell hath no fury. After the Battle of the Second Continent, I was sent back to spend some more time in the tank. Shit, I get hurt again, I might as well start growing gills. They submerged me in that sucker so much. But thankfully, they really took care of me. I was back on my feet in about 2 days. Thankfully for that, because as I was getting out of the tank, I was greeted with a surprise. I saw not one, but 2 of our angels standing there getting their armor on. I introduced myself after I, obviously put something on, and told them that I had been fighting with their sister. They asked me how she was doing, and I told them how concerned she was, but she focused on the battle itself, and that seemed to keep her mind occupied for a while. They began to get concerned with her mental welfare and decided they wanted to call her, but I insisted that they wait. I would take them directly to her, and I'm sure the look on her face would be something they would want to see. I still remember as they looked at each other, and that little sly grin that women have when they know they're about to play just a little bit of a trick on their friends. I remember trying to keep things quiet was difficult. As we got onto a shuttle, thankfully my rank and position made it easier for me to actually keep everything on the down low. We insisted on going to the second continent. Even though the shuttle was supposed to be on one side, we insisted to be on the other, as we knew the invasion would be going across that very thin strip of ocean to finally take the last continent. We knew that we were almost within range of their ordnance, so the pilots were a little nervous. However, we did not get accosted the entire way down. We knew this meant either they were saving their ordnance or they weren't sure how to hit us from the direction we were coming at. I do give props to the pilots as they came down exceptionally fast and were able to keep everything together. As we landed, I saw the gates open, and I could see off in the distance, again looking across the ocean, that white hair, well, slightly blonde actually, waving in the wind. I looked over to our 2 angels behind me, and I motioned to them, and I also motioned for them to stay quiet, as not only them, but a whole bunch of my men who had actually made it back and survived the last 2 battles came with us, and we walked up behind her. And I simply walked up, and I remember thinking, I swear if I get in that tank one more time, I'm going to be taller than her. Yet I tapped on her shoulder again. How's it going, Angel? She simply said, You have returned. Oh, I've returned all right. And I come bearing gifts. She looked a little confused and then looked at me for a moment, and I motioned behind her. She turned around and she saw her 2 sisters standing there, fully healed and in their armor. The look of elation on her face was something that is burned into my memory as she ran up, almost dropping her sword as she went to hug her sisters and welcome them back. I watched this, and many of my men actually started cheering and clapping. We have our angels back. And with our angels, there is nothing that can stop us from taking the rest of our sector back. It was only one continent, but it was the largest one, so it was going to take time. By now, the enemy had dug in. They knew that we could take 2 continents away from them, But we had lost many of our people, and they weren't sure when our attack would come. The angels insisted on going by themselves, but I looked them right in the eye, and so did one of the other commanders, and say, I don't think so. After all this, we're not losing any of you. I grabbed my angel by the arm and looked at her and whispered in her ear something just to make her blush a little bit. And I simply stated, I don't want you going by yourself. I'd hate for you to screw up that pretty face. She looked at me, and I swear for a moment she blushed. But it was enough to take her mind off the coming battle itself. And then we insisted that they go and catch up with each other and find out what was going on. I also made sure that my men brought as much food and water to them as possible, as I knew that our angel that had been fighting alongside had not stopped to eat. I started to wonder how she was still on her feet at all. And thankfully, within the next 30 minutes, I could see that she had finally relaxed enough to drift off into her meditative state. Most of us try to call it sleep, but it's not exactly sleep. Whatever they did to the angels, they don't sleep like we do anymore. It would be over a week before we were ready for the invasion, and this time the invasion would come from not just from one side, but from two at least. And we would squeeze the enemy into the center. And then once we got our heavy weapons close enough, we could begin to fire down and just pepper them as we went. However, we weren't sure how it was going to be. This was the last bastion that they had, and they would fight us for every square meter, every square centimeter of land that was there. It didn't matter if it was a millimeter. They would fight for it, because they knew only one thing was going to happen if they lost. I dreaded this, and I begged the chain of command to rescind the order to kill all. I said, can't we at least take some prisoners? Because I was not one for genocide. And of course, I was very quickly shouted down, as many of the men and many of the leadership had lost family members to the Dark Hairs and would not at any chance give them the ability to survive after this. I knew it had to be done. I hated myself for it, but I knew it had to be done as I checked and rechecked my gear, made sure all the equipment was ready, everyone was ready, going down the chain of command, making sure that everyone knew they had to have everything ready. All the bolters were reloaded. I brought the satchel of fresh bolter cartridges to the angels myself. They gladly loaded their weapons, and I even had my subordinates bring up a few extra magazines for them. They looked at us strange, like, where the hell are we going to put these? But one of the men was actually very good at working with fabrics and leathers, and he had made extra bandoliers for them. Now they carried 3 times as much ammo as they had before. They even set it up so there was a belt system. That belt system made sure that no matter how much they moved, the bandoliers that strapped across their chest would not fly out and hit them. It would not get in their way. I'd have to make sure this man got a medal later for just being clever. When we were finally ready for the final assault, not everyone was all keen and ready to go, but we knew we had to get this last task done. As we got on our transports, we got ready for the lift. This time we wouldn't be going over via ship. Only a few people would, but they would be making room inside those vessels for our heavier weapon systems. We would have to go in, and this was going to be one hell of a hot drop. As we flew as fast as we could, as low as we possibly could across the ocean, I saw several pieces of ordnance go up. I knew these were potentially missiles, and we would totally be screwed if they hit us. At the speed we were going and as low as we were, there was not a chance in holy hell for us to recover before crashing into the ocean. at what seemed like almost Mach 1.5. Yet we finally got there with minimal losses. I don't know what the hell was going up, nor did I give a crap. We would find out later that they were sending missiles to try and take our orbital ships down as they were moving across the planet. As we landed, once again, everything was a fury of flesh and steel, a maelstrom of fighting around us as any type of friendly and enemy began to mix together. You didn't know which way to turn. You were afraid to fire at points because you didn't want to go through the enemy and shoot one of your own. So it became a straight melee with handheld weapons. I holstered my weapon as I slung it across the back. I pulled both blades out, one in each hand, and I remember jumping on one of the dark hairs, climbing up the side, racking inside its ribs as I climbed up its body with my knives. It screamed in pain, lashed at me with one of its arms. I yanked out one of the knives and slashed at its arms, taking its hand clean off, and then continuing to go up till I hit its neck. At that point, the body just fell. I didn't have time to sit there and say, woohoo, look at what I just did. Instead, I simply turned to look at my next target, and screaming with a rage I didn't know I was holding in, I charged up. I could see 2 angels on my right, 1 angel on my left as they were crashing through the enemy. We ended up inside the city before long, and we had to go again door to door, room to room, building to building, block to block, as we continued to push through, our heavy weapons streaming over our heads as they crashed into the theater of war ahead of us, softening up the enemy, at least we hoped, before we got there. Even after a week, we were still trying to fight. Most of us had been exhausted so much that we had to stop and rest. Even our angels had to take some time, as the amount of dark hair that were there was simply staggering. How fast do these things repopulate? I had to try and figure out. But then again, we did call them demons for a reason. For all we knew, they produced by osmosis. After a night of barely any sleep, I still remember waking up. It was just about dawn, and went over to the sentries. The sentries were just as bad as I was, if not worse, as they had not had much sleep. I asked them if they had seen anything. Nothing, sir. Nothing on the horizon. Nothing's moved. It's like they all scattered. I said, oh no, trust me. This is from an old war dog. Believe me, they're out there. They're probably watching us right now. Then, of course, one of them looked at me and said, shouldn't you get your head down then, sir? Yeah, you're probably right. I should leave. And I backed away. I let the company rest maybe a little longer than I should have. But then something happened we weren't expecting. It was like our own artillery was sent towards us, but it wasn't ours because ours was, well, bigger. But artillery began to fire over there, and we saw buildings begin to collapse onto our positions. We tried to hide. I kept telling everybody, find somewhere safe, push up against a building. It'll keep you from getting blown the hell up. It wasn't just me. Our NCOs were running around as well, forcing people down to make sure they didn't get hit. I saw a few of our own people getting blown up. One person direct hit. There was nothing left. Even the angels were not sure which way to turn. A bunch of our men had actually pushed them down and were using their own bodies to shield the angels. And then, to our absolute horror, one of these buildings, about 20 stories tall, just fell over and fell across the top of the angels. Many men saw this and ran over to try and protect them, but the rubble fell down, and everyone's heart sank. Oh, fuck, did we just lose our angels? I suddenly felt every emotion imaginable. It all blended together as I had gotten close to one of my angels. A little too close, maybe. And I looked over in the direction, and then something came up. An unadulterated rage. You have just taken the one thing that is most precious to me, and now, And now I didn't have to say anything as screams of sheer rage came out from all around. I looked around. I raised my rifle way above my head. I looked to my left and right, and everyone was looking at each other. And I just motioned my hand forward, and we all began to charge. But as we did, we saw something amazing. A blue flash of light came from the building, and part of the rubble burst open, and the angels began to climb out. The angels rose from the ashes, from the rubble, and they were not alone, as they were followed by the men that had protected them. I ran over to my angel. "Are you all right?" She looked at me, and she smiled. That vicious smile that I love so much. And I didn't have to say it loud, but I said it loud and proud. I just yelled, "Charge!" And we flew forward, the angels jumping over. It was like our angels flew past us towards the battle line. As we ran forward, rounds kept flying out from whatever type of weapons the dark hairs were using, but we didn't care. Through rage and fury, we fired our weapons into their line. We did not stop. We did not slow down, and eventually we crashed right into them. I used a blade at the end of my weapon to go right through the chest of one of them. He was a young male. It's a shame you gotta go down, pal, but as I twisted the bayonet to make sure his sternum cracked, I unfortunately found out my bayonet had actually snapped off. I looked at it and just said, "Well, shit," and kept going. The fighting through the trenches was hard. The fight through the buildings was hard enough, and even sometimes worse, as we had to keep looking up to make sure something wasn't thrown at us, something that was going to go boom. But eventually we got to the center, and as our angels again rised from the grass, and we saw them standing there defiant and unbelievably beautiful. We didn't know how they still had the will to fight, as most of us were so exhausted we could barely stay on our feet. But as we saw them charge, as we saw them rise into battle once again, I didn't have to say anything. Neither did anyone else, as we simply charged into the final fray. And by the end of the day, it was over. Steel had won the day. And while it was over, I sat down, still trying to catch my breath, as everyone else was trying to make sure they were still breathing. Medics moved around, making sure that everyone was okay. Most of the leadership was just trying to keep up on their feet, as we were having trouble keeping up with our angels. But we found out that the angels had reached their limit as well. My angel had dropped down to one knee and then eventually sat down against the side of a broken wall. I hobbled over next to her, sat down. "So, what's next?" She looked at me with a look of, "You gotta be kidding, right?" It's like, "So, you ever thought about, I don't know, losing the sword for a little while and just living?" She still didn't say anything, but I could see she knew where I was going. She then told me how she would have to return, her and her sisters, to serve the emperor. And that was another time my heart sank. Unfortunately, my dear, that means something very bad for us. She asked me what, and I simply told her, if the emperor's army is going to come here, then we would have to be gone. Her sister came over and asked why. I simply stated that we have been trying to live in peace. The only reason this war even happened is because you guys decided to go through the nebulas at the worst possible. There's only one way in and out of this sector that's not going to tear a ship apart and force you to crash land. I mean, has your mechanicus not ever figured out how to check their sensors for that? It's pretty obvious. They all looked at me, confused. One of my platoon sergeants came up and simply stated the same thing. He's like, it's right there. You can't see it. It looks like a bunghole. The girls did not enjoy that joke, but being as tired as we were, we didn't really give a shit. However, I did see a bit of thought in my angel's eyes. She was contemplating putting down her sword. However, now I would just wait for her answer. If they wanted to leave, we weren't going to hold them. We would give them one of our less advanced shuttles to go back. But by the time they got here, we'd all be gone. We would have to blow up everything we ever built and start anew as we escaped into the void again. We told them this, as we did not want to serve anyone else and get brought into a war that just does not end. They all looked at us, and I swear, they all had that same look of contemplation. And I had only hoped, as I reached over and touched my angel's hand, that she would think, maybe there's something more to life than endless war. I was hoping that we could enjoy the moment more. I really was. But my dumbass passed out. I woke up with the angels sitting around watching. I apologized for falling asleep, and they said, don't worry about it. They were talking about what to do next, whether they should go, whether they should stay. And before I could say anything else, one of my female subordinates actually came up and added something to their conversation I was not expecting. Something that I had thought about myself, however, I didn't give it too much thought about that point. She simply reminded the angels that if they focus only on fighting, they are denying themselves something. They're never going to find balance in themselves if they do not understand that they're not just warriors. They're women too. If they deny who and what they are, they will never find balance in themselves ever, and it will actually get them killed eventually. I remember reading the old text from ancient times where, yes, warriors would focus on war so much that they lost themselves in it, that they could not break themselves away from the warfare no matter how hard they tried. And they could never find balance within themselves again because they kept denying who and what they are and who and what they were. Maybe I should spend some time on this reflection. And as I do, at least I can see my beautiful angel.